You are tuned to Farther Out. I'm your host, Douglas Lucas. This episode is part of a series of similar discussions with original members of the Process Church of the Final Judgement about their personal experiences with the group, as well as some of their theology, practices, and more. Today's talk is with Edward Mason.
When and why did you join the process? What attracted you to the group?
The outrageousness was one thing. I was living in the very middle of the English middle classes and feeling the meaning of life is not contained within my parents' lifestyle. Now, I mean, they'd been through World War II, they'd seen all that deprivation, and they just wanted a very quiet, steady life. I wanted to get out and explore not just the world, but the whole possibility of beingness. And you're looking at the mid-60s, suddenly everybody and his dog had a guru in India, or they were wearing beads around their neck, or they quietly admitted they were interested in Buddhist philosophy. And I was curious about this stuff. I actually had a personal crisis at a midnight meditation in 1970 that just sort of, I suddenly felt my life is useless. I'm not doing anything. I really need to, change everything about me. And that was the thing that pushed me up over the top and said, I'm joining these people. Because previously I thought they're great to hang out with. It's super to go in their coffee house. There was an atmosphere in that townhouse in Balfour Place in London that I loved, but I'd always thought, maybe I won't actually go into this. And at that point, that sense of I need to change me and I need to start now was the thing that personally kicked me into it. And that was in May, June of 1970.
I think the process began in 66 and ended sometime in the 70s.
1963, it started as compulsions analysis. The oldest document they said they had was June 13th, 1963. So they made that the official start of the process. By the way, we always said process, not process. Even American members had to say that. So you'd get somebody with a really thick Louisiana twang saying process. It sounded kind of weird, but that was how we did it. Yeah, so they were going a few months before June of 63 as compulsions analysis. I think within about a year, they became the process company, and there was something about a corporate charter that they existed to perform all kinds of processes into the human body, mind, spirit, soul, and other stuff. Then the experience in Mexico in Stuhl in 1966 took an existing spiritual perspective and a sort of dualistic God concept into a much more specific trinity of Jehovah, Lucifer, and Satan, and with Christ sort of hanging around on the side of that, and then Christ was assumed into it as a more, to create a quaternity, I guess, 1970, early 71, somewhere around there. So that you're always dealing with phases. When people say, what was the process like? What was it about? You think, well, give me a date. Because what was true in 1965 was definitely not true in 67. The theology was getting much more worked out by 68, 69, which was when I was hanging around them in London. And then it went through further evolutions in the early 70s. So there was it lived up to its name. It was not one fixed perspective. It was always moving on to the next level of understanding or the next aspect of totality.
What happened during your first meeting?
Well, my first meeting was simply on the street. I was trying to get into the 14-hour Technicolor Dream at Alexandra Paris in London. I'd gone with a friend. I hadn't told my parents. I was only 17. And in those days, that wasn't quite adulthood in England. I hadn't told them I'd be back really late. And this thing was going to have a whole load of bands. Pink Floyd were going to show up there. we couldn't get in. It was very late to open. It was starting to rain. And finally, I said to my friend Paul, look, we can only stay half an hour. I'm going to have to go home. And then this tall guy with a big flowing beard showed up out of nowhere. And he's dressed in black with this dashing purple cape. And he's looking right into my eyes and saying, would you like to buy a magazine? That was my first encounter with him. We sort of locked eyes and I was staring right at him. And he held the glance, which was a very strange thing for me. He didn't flinch away. And we'd already been talking about the whole hippie movement. It was still pretty new, how sincere or insincere they were. And so I thought, this guy seems to be about something. That happens to be Timothy Wiley, who died in 2017. And I was hooked at that point. I bought the magazine and thought, I think this is the thing that I need to get involved with. But involvement has levels. I was not planning on joining them at the time. And of course, when you got in, it was a very strictly organized, hierarchical organization. And had at that point taken on strong cultic aspects, which to me was a very cool idea at the time. It didn't strike me as a bad thing at all. I kind of wanted something to take me in and make me a stronger human being. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Did you have any kind of initiation ceremony?
Oh, yeah, there was always an initiation. And when I joined in 1970, we were still a rather closed group. Nothing was open to the public. After I showed up after that spiritual crisis, I showed up at the chapter in London, said I want to join. They said, well, you have to work for a few weeks to convince us, that you're serious. So I would be going up after work to help in the coffee shop, washing dishes, preparing food for about 3 weeks. Then you became an acolyte in a little ceremony. It was the first time you went into the Sabbath assembly, and you actually saw the group as a functioning religious community, all seated in a circle around a central altar. A week later, all being well, you became an initiate, yes. And you had to do that for 6 weeks minimum. Then you became a messenger of the unity, which is when they gave you your new name. You started wearing the process uniform, and you were beginning to really move into the thing. So there was a lot of sorting out that went on with people. People would say, "Yeah, I want to join," but then they'd realize I have to change everything about my life here if I'm going to join these people, because it's a complete commitment, a total commitment. A lot of people would drop out during the acolyte initiate phases, and a lot of messengers didn't make it through to becoming an inside Processean and an inside messenger. Then there were the other ranks beyond that, but I didn't get as far as those in the 2 and a bit years that I was with them.
How was your name chosen? You were Brother Luke.
That was chosen, I believe, by the head of the chapter, who then went by the name of Mother Hathor. Is it Geraldine Mahoney? She died about a year and a half ago. It was chosen intuitively. I don't know exactly the method that she used. It resonated with me immediately, so I thought, that's cool. I like that one. I'll keep it.
Describe a day in the life of being a member. What was your personal role and what were your duties?
Acolyte and initiate, you were just still doing stuff around the chapter, cleaning in the lower floors, because the inside community was upstairs and you didn't go up there. Helping a lot in the coffee shop, doing laundry and other exciting stuff. Once you became a messenger, you would take an armload of magazines or books out onto the street and go up to people and use your emerging communication skills that you've been learning in the processes twice a week in the evenings. And, hi, would you like to help us? Or just straight, would you like to help us? And then you'd say, I'm from the process, or I'm from a group that helps people with emotional problems. And you try and coax money out of their pockets or get them to buy a magazine. And that was every single day, except the Thursday was in those days was the day we closed for a day's rest. And also Sunday morning was usually quiet because the coffee shop had been open till 1 or 2 in the morning and nobody was ready to go out on the street early on. So really 5.5 days of the week, you were actually out on the street getting revenue for the organization and spreading the message.
How did people outside the group react to it?
You got every reaction possible. Get away from me, people who would just avert their eyes, people who would look kind of astonished that someone had walked up to them on the street. Some people would say, oh, wow. The majority were just feigned indifference, or indifference was their response. I don't want to have anything to do with religion. I'm not going to give the strangers money. So, I mean, you get 6 rejections to every person who'd stop. And maybe some people were much better at the street stuff than I was. I might sell half a dozen magazines in the day, but I'd also, get cash from them. Generally, the average person thought we were just kind of flaky, or we were hippies with an attitude, or they just didn't want to know.
What was the atmosphere among members as a community?
This is always hard to communicate because there has been this build-up of a sinister atmosphere around us. And I don't think anybody outside even believes that when I say, there was a lot of cheerful affection between us. And we always had a very strong, ironic sense of humor that we shared. I mean, we were there to learn from our interactions with each other and with the public, because every interaction you have was seen as reflecting some aspect of ourselves. There was a requirement that you go out there and make money, because otherwise we wouldn't survive. We didn't have these pockets despite an image of prosperity. But the idea was that we are here to learn to know ourselves and become less stuck on our own vulnerabilities and our own anxieties, our own self-doubt and all of that stuff, and to become much more accepting of all the stuff inside ourselves. And the structure of the thing was designed to support that ongoing exploration, that ongoing building up of a more effective personality.
Mm-hmm.
You asked a very big question there, because our interactions with each other were very varied. There were rivalries. There were people you found you couldn't stand. There were people who couldn't stand you. Some of the superiors in the organization were much more interactive and much more supportive than others. Sometimes you found the more detached ones were actually the more helpful, because they brought less emotion into their interactions and they could give you a more objective view on what they thought was going on. So it was quite a complex community. When I was in London, which was about 7-8 months before I came over to the States with them, I suppose there were 12 or 13 people in the inside chapter, and between 6 and a dozen of us messengers living in a separate apartment up, most of us up in St. John's Wood, not far from the Abbey Road studios.
Did you ever meet Robert de Grimston or Mary Ann?
Hardly anybody met Mary Ann after the Stuhl explosion. Maybe not, a little bit after that. But I'd say when I joined, she had withdrawn completely from direct contact with people. She maintained the mystique. And even to us messengers, she was kind of an unknown factor. We hardly knew anything about her. Robert the same, more reluctantly on his part, I understand. I could, and I probably should have met him when he was kicked out in April 1974, because fairly soon he came up to Toronto, where I was living. And I was going to go down and meet him. And I remember having a dream about being swept, falling into a stream and swept away. I was thinking, I've got out of this now. I've done as much as I could. I quit. To me, the process was either a total commitment or it wasn't a commitment. I didn't want to be back in that mid-ground. And it seemed to me that the aftermath process, the the group that was trying to get organized after Robert was kicked out, based around him, it didn't have what I wanted or needed at that point. So I didn't go to see him, and I've never met the man.
During your time, were there any celebrities who hung around or showed an interest in the group? I know there's a lot of quotes in the magazines from various celebrities of the time.
They are people, or were people, who we met on the street, and some of the superiors in the organization had some contact with them, like George Clinton with Funkadelic. But no, our coffee house wasn't a place where I saw celebrities. Now, Timothy Wiley told me that Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, was always in the coffee shop. Maybe he was. Maybe he came in and I just didn't know who this guy was. I mean, a couple of times I ran into famous people on the street, people who were famous at the time, and I just didn't recognize them. So the answer really is no, I didn't. They weren't coming around the coffee shop. And then in the early 70s, when we decided to improve our PR by doing a lot more social work, the coffee house became a place where a lot of people who were not doing too well in life hung out. I felt that it was a bit of a turnoff for more together people. If they came in and found they were sitting next to some, an alcoholic who was having real difficulties, they're not going to come back a second time.
Right. What about the German Shepherds? I know there was a lot in the group, and how many were there, and why was that particular breed valued?
I think it's simply because Mary Ann liked the dogs. I mean, she liked animals, and she liked German Shepherds, and she thought, let's get some. And I don't think there's any significance deeper than that. We had 3 of them in the Toronto chapter, which was where I was when I finally moved into the inner chapter, and I was looking after them. I mean, some of my strongest memories are cleaning up dog poop after they've had accidents. A couple of them were quite lively animals, and one of them was a much more sedate fella. But actually, we might have had 4. But they were just dead dogs. They were just pets. And if you get into a conspiracist mindset, everything is significant. I can remember asking the same question: why German Shepherds? And the answer I got was a sort of baffled, well, they're nice dogs. That's all there was to it.
Yeah.
But if you're a conspiracist, everything is significant and indicates always not only a motive but a dark motive.
Yeah. When the group evolved into more of a spiritual type of organization, what was the theology? How did they view the relationships of Jehovah, Lucifer, Satan, and Christ? Was it more theological, spiritual, or was it more philosophical, psychological?
The answer to that is yes, on all points. I don't know exactly what was going on with compulsions analysis, and I did ask questions. I think people tended to forget. One problem when you're documenting the process is that Mary Ann in particular, as I understand it, had an extraordinary power of subtle suggestion. And she would suggest to people that old ideas were no longer valid, new perspectives were more valid. Therefore, a lot of stuff got forgotten. I've had talks with old senior members. I had a number with Timothy Wiley, and I thought, I got to check what you just told me. I'm sure I've got a document or a personal memoir at home that says that's not what happened. And I got different perspectives. I asked somebody once whether it was very religious at first. I was told, no, not at all. Somebody else who'd been there at the beginning said to me, yes, it was always very spiritual. Now, bear in mind, they were doing therapy initially with the e-meters and later with an intuitive form of interrogation. When you really start probing what people feel and think about life, not just, why are you upset about the fact that your mother never loved you, but, what you really feel about existence, inevitably spiritual stuff comes up. one lady, Mother Cassandra, who died just this year, she told me that stuff started coming up for her about God and Christ. And she said, I wasn't a religious believer at all. I'd had that stuff at school, but I wasn't interested. And I couldn't understand where it was coming from, but it was a much deeper part of me. Now, everyone is coming up with this individually. The only people who've got the overview are Robert and Mary Ann, who will sit around comparing all the notes, and they would have these hours-long, not brainwashing, what's the word? Brainstorming.
Yeah.
Brainstorming sessions. They were brainwashing as well, but they would brainwash the stuff and started getting the beginnings of the duality. You know, God is darkness and light. It's all of the experience that we go through. You know, they started drifting into a Gnostic perspective. Imagine more of it. The Christian stuff came from Robert, who'd been to a standard upper class English education, and I'm sure they had Bible classes and prayers, English boarding school every day and every evening. Mary Ann would have had a rather wilder view. And I don't know but exactly, but in one of her early interviews, she said she'd studied tarot, astrology, and so on. So she'd been kind of checking out occultism and esotericism. And that might have been what led her to Scientology, because she'd been into it for about a year, maybe longer. Robert was only in for apparently a few weeks before the pair of them left and started compulsions analysis. So it was a constant thing of the brainstorming. Later on, the senior members would be brought into these sessions and they would throw in their observations. And gradually, the outline of Jehovah, who was representing the spiritual side of the mind, and Lucifer, who was representing the physical and body and world-oriented side of the mind, emerged as the primary duality. These things, two forces can be in harmony. They also have a lot of conflict between them. So they're playing a kind of game of conflict. From Scientology, we took the concept of games. Satan came in later, and it's always hard to get across to people the simple idea. Satan itself is a divided being. It, on the one hand, wants to get away from everything physical into a super spiritual universe. You know, you just want to be the guy in the cave meditating on the infinite. And alternatively, to get away from the pressures of the mind and the spiritual demand, which means basically sex, drugs, rock and roll, and who the hell gives a shit anyway? Those are very strong forces in us. And it's not that I'd say this was the truth, but it was a functional system. It worked, it was viable. From this, we worked out a psychological theory examining different tendencies in all of us. Christ came in as the mediating, unifying force. So you can imagine a mandala, Satan at the top and the bottom, Jehovah on one side, Lucifer on the other, the Christ in the middle, in contact with all four aspects, and gradually bringing the whole thing back into some kind of coordinated integrity. But some people would be more spiritually oriented in their lives. Some would be more around the world and human relations and things of the world. You know, I mentioned Timothy Wiley. He was Luciferian satanic because he was an artist. He designed the magazines much of the time. I don't think he did all of it, but he did most of it. And had a really wild perspective on extraterrestrial beings that I, as a Jehovah's Christian, just could not possibly begin to understand. It all struck me as airy-fairy. And I was me, and of course I was secretly jealous that he was able to contact these things that I couldn't sense at all. So you would have something on what we call the non-mind side, satanic or Christian, and you would be on the mind side, you would tend to be more Jehovah, you tend to be more Lucifer. And this was being worked out over the whole It all came in at Stuhl, or started to come in at Stuhl. So for another 7 years, this was being worked on more and more elaborately. The idea was, if you know your God pattern, then you know who you are, and you know your relationship to the ultimate capital G God.
Yeah, I've bought a couple collections of the magazines, and I think it's called the God Quiz. And I've done those, and every time I've done them, I always come out the same. How were the members' gods assigned? How did you identify with particular god?
It took a long time. You were every week you would have some sort of therapy session where you were looking at your own compulsions. There would be an initial problem thing, which was, what's a problem to you? Oh, and why? What have you invalidated in this problem? Why? You must have committed a hostility to cause this. Why? And it was in the fourth one that isn't coming into my mind at the moment. That was your initial cycle. Then you would go down into something else, a particularly elaborate cycle of major areas of compulsion for you. Personal example, I had endless stuff about self-invalidation. It drove me crazy. I couldn't stand it anymore. Finally, it clicked with me. And it was made plain that because I was called Luke, which means of the light, I thought I was Luciferian. And so I said, no, you're heavily into self-blame, self-limitation, self-criticism. You're Jehovian. And you have a sense of weakness, which is one of the negative sides of the Christian path. So you're trying to overcome that weakness by being here with us. Therefore, you're displaying the fact that you are Jehovian Christian. That came in about a year and a half after I joined. It took that long for me to get to the point where I actually knew what my real pattern was. So nobody was telling me where I belonged. Some people it came sooner, but as I said, I was raised in the English middle classes. There were no emotions. The English middle classes used to talk about attacks of emotion. Don't get all emotional. Displaying emotion is a social crime. So that doesn't encourage you to know who you are. You're just supposed to conform to a social code. And here I was breaking down that social code. It took a year and a half, which wasn't bad. I'm just coming into my early 20s here, and I find out more or less my general pattern. So at that point, okay, now I know the weak areas. It's easier for me to deal with them.
Was there any sense of salvation from a traditional standpoint, a Christian standpoint, or something like that? Or
we believe in universal salvation. All beings were aspects of God. Ultimately, all beings would be reabsorbed into God. Whatever you went through on the way back, there was no such thing as a permanent hell. You could, according to the universal law, which is the same thing as the law of karma, you would only suffer the consequences of your actual actions. So eventually you'd run out of karma to pay off and you would make it back to God. It was assumed that by joining the process, you've taken a big step towards your own ultimate salvation, simply by saying, I'm willing to, give my life to this thing and be part of it. So I don't think we worried that much about salvation. Now, I say we, I can remember one woman who was really haunted by I don't know what was in her mind, but she was really afraid of being rejected by God. I assume it was something in her upbringing, because our parents shape our ideas of God generally. And the culture at large produces the rest of it. And maybe there's an element that we have brought in through cultural inheritance or past lives or whatever perspective you fall into. So you've got to work through all of that and learn to accept that as part of your reality. But the more you've accepted whatever burdens you have taken on in life, the easier it is for you to achieve a more ongoing connection to the divine. The answer really to your question is no, we weren't obsessed with salvation, because there was going to be salvation for everybody. It was an ongoing process. I mean, that was the whole process was about drawing all these scattered shards and fragments of the ultimate unity back towards it. The world was supposedly ending. Everything was being drawn back willy-nilly. Either you went with conscious cooperation like ourselves, or you were dragged there regardless. So it was happening anyway. But yeah, it would take longer for some people, or just be more agonizing.
Who are the gray forces?
Everything that tends to diminish or dull the sacred. That is, if you were a Jehovian satanic personality. Okay. So you would have some definite urge towards transcendent beliefs and transcendent experience. You would also have, I would assume, a rather strong and definable code of ethical right and wrong. Now, the gray forces are telling you, well, don't get too, high on morality because everything's relative. And, people get upset if you start becoming too critical of them. And the gray forces would be everybody around you telling you, don't go too transcendent, you'll lose your mundane connection to the world and things will start to get weird for you. I know my own mother was terrified of weirdness. It was something that haunted her, the idea of weirdness. Of course, she was not upset. She was not happy when I got into this, but it was too late. I'd already made the decision. So the gray forces are very indefinite. They're not black or white. They're not defined. They're not definite. They're just simply those things that suck us down. Entropy, apathy, mild anxiety, desire for social conformity, all of that stuff.
What were some of the regular practices for members, such as Sabbath assemblies and things like that?
The Sabbath assembly was done every Saturday. I guess the further up you got into the organization, the only really regular thing necessarily was your weekly therapy sessions. The Sabbath assembly involved us singing our own Processean hymns, reading from the sacred writings that Robert had produced. There was also a book of relevances by senior people that we used at one point. They would have written something inspired or poetic that was their particular individual perspective on what was happening to the world at this time. So some of them were quite apocalyptic and some of them were kind of sweet, depending, again, what the person's God pattern was. And there would be a spontaneous revelation by the evangelist. You'd have the sacrificist who was presiding, representing the Christ, and the evangelist representing Satan at the other end of the alpha room, as we called it, and there would be this circle of people, in between them. So the evangelist would just produce something, spontaneously inspired based on process teaching. And it would take about an hour. There'd be a brief meditation somewhere in there. And then we'd all sing a rousing hymn to finish, and the evangelist and sacrifice would leave as we were finishing the hymn, and somebody would declare, our brethren, our assembly is ended as it is, and everyone would yell, so be it. And that was the basic thing.
And you said there were official hymns?
Oh, yes. We had our own hymn book.
Who wrote those?
Everybody. Not Robert and Mary Ann, but different members of the group. Some people, I think, were more prolific than others. They didn't have bylines on them. So I occasionally heard that, so-and-so wrote this hymn, so-and-so wrote that hymn. Some people would just write the lyrics and get somebody else to come up with a tune. But I was never directly involved in hymn production, so I couldn't tell you a great deal about the business. It just, things came to people and they would produce something.
Were they more traditional sounding hymns or more modern song type of structure?
The whole range. So some of them were almost what you might have heard in early Christians chanting down in the catacombs. Others of them were much more upbeat and with a modern type of rhythm. And there were some things that were in between. There was quite a range of styles and rhythms and colors to the song.
Did you attend any of the telepathy, developing circles, healing meditations, etc.?
The healing meditations came in after I left. Telepathy developing circles were held every Friday for the public. So that was one of my first encounters with group activity. And you would do psychometry on a partner in the circle. Everything was done in circles. And there would be a group meditation on a particular theme, seeing if we all came up with a common perspective, and you would share what you got with the group. Then later on, inside, privately, there was more what we called subliminal communication training, where you were attempting to actually make telepathic contact with concepts, not just beings or people, but concepts, animals in the chapter. I mean, we had one hilarious session once talking telepathically with the dogs. And people will say, so you had to imagine stuff. My answer on that is, well, if you prefer to think of it that way, okay. But I actually think that we have the ability to do a certain amount of mind reading once we were living in the present moment fully and energetically. Not just, trying to be mindful, but actually fully present in the present time.
What were some important texts for the group? Spiritual, philosophical?
Oh, everything. If it came from Robert, it was, divinely revealed. I think, everyone had their own selections. I mean, things were being withdrawn all the time. It wasn't like, once it was written, it was always there. He'd done 7 logics, as he called it, about basic psychological mechanisms. The longest and most elaborate one, Responsibility is Choice, was about the fact that ultimately we are making everything that's happening in our lives is something that we ourselves have deliberately brought about. We've chosen that it would be so. That to me was a fascinating and troubling idea when I first came across this before I joined. And I had a couple of conversations with other people who found it just haunted them. It was just a fascinating idea that maybe we are actually creating these lives that we find so unsatisfactory. Now, of course, that means, well, you've got to resolve the negative sides of yourself that are producing negative outcomes, and the best thing to do would be to join the process. But that always helped me. Robert also had the BI, Brethren, Information, and I think there were about 3,000 of those by the time he was done. They covered more spiritual concepts such as the universal law, our concept of karma, such as not resisting evil, Christ's quote, resist not evil, which it's somewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, but I couldn't tell you the exact verse. It was a little bit of expounding of scriptural verses, but mostly it was his own inspired stuff that he would brainstorm with Marianne and sometimes with other people. There was a fascinating one on how do you deal with depression, because you can't necessarily dislodge it. It's a matter of accepting the fact that it's there rather than struggling with yourself and condemning yourself for being depressed a lot of the time. What else was there? There was one on male-female relationships. There were others on how we should see ourselves in the process, how we should relate to other people outside. And there were a couple of efforts to explain the entire universe to, this is how the gods interact and they produce the world that we live in. Jehovah and Lucifer began with a conflict, an aggressive conflict between them. And that's how it all started. And then he traces out all the ways it's come down to the present time in our very split up universe of a human world. And more stuff than that as well. And they're not all coming to mind at the moment.
Over the years, I've collected some booklets and things by Robert, and I've always found his writing to be really fantastic. Even if you weren't a member or weren't there, the writing is still relevant in a way, even now, if you pick it up and look at it.
It's very lucid. It is internally consistent once you accept the fundamental perspectives that the process had. We are spiritual beings having a human experience, going through space and time together. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. Therefore, we are looking at things from the other end of the telescope to everybody else. Once accepted that we are part of despite all our failings and our limitations and the stuff we don't yet know and the stuff is not worked out, we have been chosen by God to do this thing, and we are here to spread the message of the final end and the reuniting of the gods and the unity of Christ and Satan. That was implicit there. If you got into that mindset, then everything that Robert is saying is pretty much consistent and often very insightful, and a lot of things about human nature.
Yeah.
People tell me he was very much inside his head. Marianne was much more grounded, but I think he was less trying to manipulate people and more really trying to explore what the reality was made up of.
Was there a sense of real apocalyptic destruction, the end of the world, or was it metaphor, so to speak?
I think there was more of that in the late 60s, which was our strong Jehovian phase. When I joined, it was switching over to being centered more around Lucifer, or at the time that we called the new game. No, we weren't obsessed with the end and disaster. I mean, we discussed it with people on the street, but it was a kind of a matter-of-fact thing. The world's ending, and the same sort of breath as, looks like it's going to rain tomorrow. It was just a given. And we were with each other. We were all in the same boat in the process, so we would get through to the end in whatever way was required. It was earlier than I was in. It was a much darker perspective, more dramatic. Somebody once told me that Robert had said that we all need to have a reality on ourselves actually being murdered by humanity. It might be that rough. So you need to have, anticipate that they're not going to give us a round of applause. We're actually going to be going through a very rough time at the end of the world.
What's one of your favorite memories as a member? And what would you say is one positive thing and one negative thing that you took away?
There's a lot of favorite memories. I think mostly it comes down to those moments when our ability to really communicate about feelings. You get into a little discussion and somebody would confess something that they'd never ever said. I mean, one young woman I was rather close to admitted to me one time that she'd been a heroin addict before she joined, and she'd never said anything about this. And she'd been in a dysfunctional relationship with another addict, and she just sort of let it spill out for 5 minutes. It wasn't that I said anything wise or wonderful. It was just suddenly she felt able to trust me and poured all of this stuff out. And I assumed from that point on, she was able to see that experience more objectively. And there were a whole load of moments like that, I think. That one stays very clear for me, but we would just at times have a great sense of being truly in touch with another human being. What didn't I like? I think in the Luciferian game, we were working much more through the image we projected, and people kept talking about being more positive and positivity. Now, as a Jehovian, I suppose I objected to that ideologically, but mostly it just felt, I don't think we're being real anymore. And with conversations I had with people after all it had all gone down and all fallen apart, and people I ran into, we hated that time, we were all being so positive. When you're actually letting the negativity out, the pain, the anger, the personal sense of limitations, there's a sense of release that comes with it when you're trying to be upbeat. To this day, I have a very strong prejudice against people who insist on positivity. First of all, be real. Then once you get to reality, it's not like you're stuck in your misery because you've accepted it. You can begin to detach from all of that stuff. You can begin to step away and get on with enjoying a life. So I think that was probably as much as anything that made me feel rather isolated. And I finally thought, I can't continue with this thing. It's just becoming fake for me. Other people, if they were having a very different experience, they didn't like the harsher, stricter, earlier time and felt a great sense of relief with the more upbeat, more positive Luciferian perspective. Everyone was very individual. So I'd say that's my strongest positive and strongest negative memory that I've brought away with me.
So essentially, in the early days, what you would call the more Jehovian period, it was much darker, much more apocalyptic. And then later, toward the end, it became more Luciferian and more trying to project a positive image from the whole thing.
I think early on, there was much more of a stress in the Jehovian phase of personal responsibility for all of your own failings and limitations. What are you going to do about it? We'll help you discover what those things are, but you need to move on from that and become a stronger, more self-determined person. I was comfortable with that idea, but of course I wasn't a member then. It was far more of a challenge for me to be smiley face about it. I liked the idea of a small, rather conservative, enclosed group. I didn't like the way we opened our religious ceremonies to the public. I didn't like the way that we were being more embracing of people that once we would have just said, well, if you got your life into a dreadful mess, it's not our fault you chose to do that. You're responsible for it.
Right.
We tended to be, we were moving away from that, and I kept thinking that this isn't real. I remember just before I finally left having an interview with the masters of, they were called the masters of the temple. I'm saying, well, what's happened to our sense of responsibility? And, oh, it'll come back, it'll come back. And I thought, yeah, but it won't come back this year, and it won't come back next year, because we're supposed to be doing this for a 7-year period of time, according to the theory, and we're only 2 years into this. This is not meeting my need to have a purposeful life, and I'm feeling increasingly at odds with this. So, finally I thought, okay, I have to go, and I went.
What would you say the essence of the process, or I should say the process, was?
I wouldn't. Essentially indefinable. You'll remember in Neil, Sympathy for the Devil documentary, has all those people up front. What was the process? And they're all going, well, that's rather hard to say. I mean, Robert wrote a book, If a Man Asks. What is the process? The process is the presence of God upon earth, which doesn't really answer the question, because now you need to say what is presence of God and what is God, and in what sense is that presence here on earth. So it was a constant, everyone would have to give you their own individual perspective on that. As far as I could do that, what would I say? It was, for me, about sharing a collective experience that produced individual realizations of who I was and of who I might be as a spiritual being living in a human life.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
To reiterate the fact that we were not obsessed with apocalypse and disaster. We were not fanatical. Above all, what fascinated me with the process was that immediately there was a sense of humor. They kept making jokes, including jokes about God and jokes about the end. It's like, well, what's going on with these guys? They're not fanatics. They're very at ease with their own spiritual perspectives. That was what hooked me. Not that I was taken in by a brainwashing cult. I mean, that was part of the thing, but mostly the fact that they could be ironic and objective about their own lives and their own experiences.